Hello, no mai, haere mai, and welcome to Late at the Museum for October 2011. Life on the Margins, Otherness in New Zealand. As you may have guessed there, I am Russell Brown, and I trust you'll be entertained, informed, and possibly even provoked tonight. If anyone tells you that before the 70s, New Zealand was a place of golden spiritual weather, they're lying. Prosperous, kind, and fond of machinery we might have been, but New Zealand was also fiercely intolerant of difference. In his 1952 essay, Fretful Sleepers, Bill Pearson bluntly described our willingness to persecute those who don't conform. Not only social status was grounds for suspicion, but so, wrote Pearson, was any variation from the norm. The man with a cleft palate, with a stutter, with short sight will suffer. In short, he wrote, there is no place in normal New Zealand society for the man who is different, or woman, presumably. So where are we now? More diverse, certainly, but where are our margins, and how is life out there? Does the man with a stutter still suffer? Do some of us still have more human rights than others? As we contemplate youth riots in Britain, are we creating an alienated generation of our own? These are the things we'll talk about tonight. Now to the panellists. To describe Philip Paxton as a gay, disabled, vegetarian, former social worker and sometime comedian makes him sound like the punchline to a particularly elaborate joke about Grey Lynn. But that is indeed what he is. I have long enjoyed his shit sandwich approach to delivering challenging ideas, and I'm delighted to welcome him to the panel. Next to Philip. Next to Philip, Ella Henry. Ella is known to New Zealanders as an academic, a former human rights commissioner, a businesswoman, and as the dispenser of very sound advice on Māori television's Ask Your Auntie. But she has another story, that of the 16-year-old girl found on K Road by James K. Baxter and given the shelter of the poets' community, along with others who society didn't care to know. She has, in a real way, looked at life from both sides now. To my immediate right, David Cohen. David and I share a particular life-changing experience as fathers of children on the autism spectrum. Yet our backgrounds and, to some extent, our present politics are very different. I moved smoothly through school. David was what we used to call a juvenile delinquent. Dispatched, as he wrote in his memoir, Little Criminals, to a boys' home. David is also part of the 7,500 strong New Zealand Jewish community. Jacinda Ardern completes the panel. Life has taken Jacinda from Murupara to New York and back to become Labour's Employment and Youth Affairs spokesperson. I've been impressed by her pursuit of issues in those portfolios, and that's why she's here. Please welcome them all. Another thing that Philip has written about quite a lot, though he prefers not to use the word now, but I'm advised, is culture in terms of disability. Mm-hmm. Your son Elliot is profoundly autistic. Mm-hmm. Do you nonetheless see him as having a culture? Because I know with my kids who are in a different place on the spectrum, I do.
The subject of culture is, I'm not a multiculturalist. I prefer to call myself a cosmopolitan.
Do you cringe?
I prefer to call myself a cosmopolitan.
Right. Do you reach for your revolver when you hear the word diversity?
I like individualism.
Should I start moving now?
I like individualism, and as one of my axioms in life is that the mob is always wrong, even when it's right. So autism is nothing if not profoundly individualistic. Autos means individual. But culture sounds, culture is what you have for supper or breakfast, or it's a light word. I'd rather talk about the humanity of people period.
Clearly you're not Māori.
And what do you mean by that?
Culture's a huge word for us.
Explain.
Maori is a huge word, but culture?
Yeah.
What?
Well, I just, culture is what we do. That's my definition when I teach culture in my classes. I say the easiest definition of culture is what we do around here. So you only know you're outside of your culture when you find you're doing different stuff to other people. So as far as I'm concerned, we've all got cultures, I mean, I went through cultures of youth and cultures of revolt, and now I'm just in the culture of grumpy old fat people. Which in so many ways is really liberating. I am really enjoying being grumpy. So anyway, so sorry to go, and I'm not being flippant about your question because I think it's, but culture is a word in English that we as a people have adopted to help enshrine the things that we think are special. So cultural artefacts, cultural characteristics, the stuff we would call in Māori tikanga. But in English we use the word culture. So, I feel very strongly that the word is huge. And I have problems, I'm sorry, darling, with the word diversity. Because diversity is just, to me, a word white people invented to tell me I'm different. Well, I've had to be the bearer of ill tidings, but I figured that out all on my own without being told I'm diverse, dude. So, I maybe have a slightly different interpretation of those words.
Well,
but what do I know, I'm from New Lynn.
Well, with respect,
When a white man says that at the beginning of a sentence, you better be really careful if you're a brown, Sheila. Okay, bro.
Okay. In 2 lines, when I wrote my book Little Criminals, plug for Radio New Zealand, which is largely a Maori study, which the book I wrote largely has to do with the Maori experience in New Zealand in the 1970s. But my point is...
Did you become a Māori in the 1970s?
Well, if you went to...
He can write about it.
If you were a state warden boys' home, you were an honorary Maori, believe me.
Or you were somebody's bitch.
Or both.
Both.
But no, my only point, linguistic point here is I try to avoid the word culture. I use the word the Maori nation because to me, nation is big. This was and is actually a Maori nation. We are settlers, interlopers, whatever, visitors, guests. As I say, culture to me is a light word. We've all got culture, different culture. I take your point, but this land is a Maori nation.
Land.
Yes, it is.
This land
no,
is
it's not
your
actually.
land.
No, it's not my land.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's not my land.
I know.
And
well, it kind of is.
Well, by birth, sure, but anyway.
I'm not Hone Harawira.
Good.
They're from the other side of the Mangamuka Range. It's your land.
Can I say about diversity? I don't mind the word, but I agree with you that diversity now is categorisation and representation, right? So my work is about redefining it. I see diversity as how we're unique and how we're common. Your sons are unique. They're not disordered. I'm not disordered. We're unique. Everyone else is common and a little bit boring, and it's the same with your idea of diversity being, a way of saying you're different. Different is a negative way of saying unique. And similar is the Pākehā way of saying common, And the reason I don't like saying culture is that culture for me, one, it gets confused with art and tradition and the taonga and that sort of thing. But also what we are all doing is experiencing and expressing. So we experience the world, we respond by expressing ourselves, and then we respond to the experience of other people responding to our expression, and that builds something that's changing all the time. And so there's something around acknowledging that all this stuff is changing. And again, it's back to the decay and realising that when culture changes, it's decaying, and part of that decaying is preparing the ground for new growth. And how can we create that new growth in a positive way by fertilising the soil so that what we grow is better, well, not better, but at least as good as what has decayed.
You would have made a great hippie with Ella.
Well, I took drugs in the 80s, so I know stronger down in
We left a few for you.
I want to turn to Jacinda, because one of the original things we talked about when we first started planning this, the youth riots in England, not in Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, it must be pointed out, had just been all over the news. And we immediately started thinking, could it happen here? I think, Jacinda, everyone agrees that we're not, whatever the degree of youth alienation or youth unemployment, we're not going to see riots here, are we?
Well, it depends. I mean, I guess what we saw in the UK was an en masse expression of something. And what I think we have in contrast in New Zealand is singular expressions of the same thing. So whilst we might not have these large congregation of youth displaying their disquiet with society, I think, you know, every single young person that manifests in a youth court, that is our version of a London riot. Because in those young people, I often listen to Andrew Beecroft, our principal youth court judge, talk about the young people he sees come before him time and time again. You could take those young people, put them in a room, and almost all of them will have 5 of the same things. There'll be social deprivation, poverty, drug and alcohol abuse, family violence, often gang-related incidents as well, and they'll be disengaged from education and employment, often as a consequence of those things. So for me, you know, all of the things that manifested in those London streets, we already have, but perhaps it's easier to turn a blind eye because they're not throwing rocks and stealing televisions en masse.
What about father absence?
I mean, I think, you know, I'm loath to set definitions around what kind of families produce what kind of kids. I mean, you know, we actually did in Parliament, we did a bit of an inquiry into, you know, how do we produce child offenders in New Zealand? And I remember this discussion where one of the politicians, I said, well, look, we already know. We know this list. We have it in front of us. And I heard one of the politicians say, but actually, why don't we look at how you could have all of those things in your life and turn out okay? And I thought, why would we want to produce a nation of kids who turn out all right in spite of themselves? Why instead aren't we actually looking at all those precursors, because they're right there in front of us? Right. The most alarming statistic I've heard since my term in Parliament, and you hear a lot of statistics and we churn them back at you, but the worst one I've heard is that 40% of 15-year-old plus Māori males will have served some kind of community-based or prison detention. 40%. Now, we only need to go back to the stat that says 50% of our Māori males are leaving school and not moving into further educational work to see what's happening there, and then go further back again to see how they manifest in our health and in our poverty indexes to see the trajectory. Why aren't we back at the beginning? Every time, why aren't we back at that beginning?
Can I just say, you know, seeing as we're talking about my lot, I remember 20 years ago, John Tamahere said this, back when he made sense. And he made a great deal of sense when he gave the speech in 1991, and he talked about how much economic worth a Māori who's on the wrong side of the tracks generates. And he mentioned the sum of $1.4 million in economic worth we are if we continue being mad, bad, and sad. Because you've got all the people who work in courts, you've got the social workers, you've got the jailers. You know, if we actually got over being mad, bad, and sad, 20,000 of you lot would be out of work.
I don't feel Jacinda.
I wasn't talking about you as politicians.
No.
I don't. Again, with respect, and I'm not going to say.
Really,
that again.
dude, you've got to stop using
yeah,
that phrase. It just means I'm going to say something really rude now.
Okay, I'm going to say something really rude just for a moment. The question about father absence, which to me is pivotal when it comes to the violent, which is to say characteristic behaviour of young men. To me, it's axiomatic that Borstalls, institutions, any crime data you want to put forward, you will find huge father absence among young men.
I just wonder
can
how
I
much
actually-
of it's hard to extrapolate that between them not having a father and them not
But that's
having
also not
love in their home and other
cause.
things and grounding and
we
hope
could-
and confidence and, all of those things, Is it about just the absence of a male or is it about the whole package?
I think both. I don't think they're alternatives. Young men are innately violent. They're innately aggressive. And that's a wonderful thing. I think chauvinistically we'd all be living in caves were it not for that, as it were, male impulse. But it can be devastating if it's not controlled, channeled, nurtured in the most loving way, of course. As I say, with youth crime, absent fathers, the absence of presence.
Can I interrupt this classic left versus right?
Yeah.
Is that what
Really?
you're saying?
Because I was just ready to go, Russell.
David, the American Bar Association about 5 years ago came out with a report that was absolutely damning of what had happened in the American justice system. Basically, the short of it was that getting tough on crime was creating father absence and making every problem worse. That
So
basically
getting
tough on
crime
crime,
was-
mandatory minimum sentences, longer sentences, basically being harsher on crime, was having an utterly counterproductive effect because it was creating.
And Russell, I guess
I'd
that's
rather
why
absence.
I guess that's why I raised
agree
that
with
statistic, because it's not in and of itself to say this is what's happened to 40% of our Māori community. That's to say, well, what is then the consequence of that? When you live in a society when a prisoner that comes out of a prison basically is given enough cash to get them to the night shelter, and beyond that you're on your own, where employment opportunities then become pretty tough, housing near impossible, what are we then saying to that person at that point in their lives about where their future lies and where their kids' future lies? Now, I would much rather focus on the front end rather than the back end, but we've got to look at both
but
and
the
the
back end is what
ongoing
creates.
consequences of that.
Can I just make another point here? Sorry, because we're talking about a lot of stuff that are social problems, and for me as a Māori, who a lot of these problems focus on, I see most of them as effects. Fatherless families, poverty, domestic violence, substance abuse. They're to me effects.
Consequences.
And I still live in a country where I am not allowed to discuss the cause. I am not allowed to mention the word colonisation. I say colonisation in front of, smart white people, and they go, oh no, we've sorted that out. And I go, which world do you live in? Because, Garth George this morning in the Herald is telling me that the victim mentality is a problem, because I'm not a victim. Of course I'm not. We're just terminally criminal and stupid. Of course everybody knew that. So, you know, I mean, trying to fix up effects, and I'm not just talking about Māori issues now, but I mean, I think in any country you go there, I was in London 3 weeks ago, you know, and it's a black issue. You know, those riots were a race issue that nobody wants to deal with.
No, there were a lot of poor white kids in those
There
riots,
were,
Ella.
and they came along, but at the beginning, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so on, because I was staying in Suffolk, it was like, you know, these were the people I was talking to. So we're kind of trying to plug holes in effects. And I think until we can deal with all of the causes and the depths of causes, and I'm not just talking about Māori issues now, because there's all sorts of other problems that I think are about looking deeper.
And quite clearly, we could have gone on for another hour, I think, but our time is up. I've really enjoyed this. I had no idea truly where it was going to go. And I'm not even sure where it ended up. But it has been marvellous, so please thank our panellists again.